Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our first week of Sociocultural. This week we're looking at a bit of history and philosophy of education. The idea is just to introduce you to some key terms and ideas. Now, this quote on the screen is sort of what I want you to think about throughout the entire unit. Okay, so it comes from Einstein or Henry Ford. We're not 100% sure which one, but that notion that if you always do what you always did, you will always get what you always got. And the reason why I've used that is, well, a lot of what we do in schooling, we end up in the classroom and everyone goes, look, this is the way we do things around here. And the notion being that, well, the way that we do things was inevitably good and right. And you probably got that in a couple of pracs too. The whole, look, you've done your uni stuff, now this is what happens in the real world type approach. Well, that might be good in terms of working with existing practice, but the reality is we can't look around the world and say, well, what's happening in education with all kids is perfectly good and right. In that case, we don't need to change or improve anything. So if we keep thinking about, well, what we're doing might be okay for some kids, it might be working for us as teachers, but look, there are people that we know that aren't succeeding in education, and if we keep doing, that's not going to change. So that's why it becomes something that we need to think about in terms of that. Moving ahead, just a little bit about the unit. Sociocultural politics, bit of a mouthful, okay? So hence, it's really about, look, what's the social influence on students and their backgrounds in schooling? What's the cultural influence on students and their background in their schooling? What's politics got to do with it? Different political ideologies and understandings and differences. In the end, the unit is about difference, okay? It's about class, culture and identity. And it might not be something that you've all thought about in the past. It's often something we take for granted. Most of us are in a situation that we're in the university degree, because schooling's worked out for us, education's worked out for us. It's got us to where we want to be. But we know that about a third of the population ends up at university. So that means 2/3 don't. And if university is how we measure success in education, then that means 2/3 don't get there. Do they all have to get there at all? Well, that's the question really, isn't it? When you think about that in terms of your classroom, in some schools, or on average, only a third, getting closer to maybe a half-ish now with the expansion of education, are going to go on to further education and training at the best of times. Okay, so if that's our goal, we're actually not meeting the needs of half of our students, and we need to be mindful of that. It might be something that I don't know that we've necessarily ignored it per se, but because things have worked for us, we haven't had to think about it. We also have to keep in mind in this discussion that the ACT is a particularly unique jurisdiction. Equity issues here are not as obvious as in some jurisdictions around the country, because we have a high relative advantage in the ACT. And we'll talk a little bit about that next week. In terms of this week, in terms of the we've always do what we always did, we'll always get what we've always got approach, I want to introduce you to a little bit of ideas from history and sociology. So, thinking historically here is a disposition to thinking about the influence of the past on what we do in the present and what that will mean for the future. Now, history, a number of you would have done a little bit of history because of your degrees and might be teaching it in the primary area, can be sort of divided into the memory history and disciplinary history. So remembering Anzac and Federation, that's all the memory stuff. But the disciplinary history, well, that's actually about how we think historically, how we think through history to influence our understanding of the present. And that comes down over here to sort of substantive knowledge, so knowledge of history, but also comes down to things like our procedural knowledge. And this is where I want you to be thinking. Things like concepts of historical significance, continuity and change, progress and decline, the use of evidence, and empathy. So in terms of us thinking historically, thinking about the influence of history on our work as teachers, well, what's significant, what's changed and what hasn't, what's improved and what hasn't, what evidence do we have to base that on, and how can we understand people of the past. When you have a look at these slides, and I'm not going to dwell on these details in these short snippets, I want to try to keep them under 10 minutes, is thinking historically is basically a difference between knowing stuff about the past to thinking about the past and learning from it. Okay, this is where we want to be. The other notion here is C. Wright Mills' sociological imagination. And that's coming from the foundational thinkings in sociology, that the ability to see the connections between our personal troubles and social structures. Okay, not that you necessarily have troubles per se, but it's basically be able to see that your circumstances, as you know them now, are often produced by the social structures around us. And neither the life of an individual or the history of a society can be understood without understanding individuals' lives and history, how they come together in social circumstance to produce the present. And hence, what we want to do in sociology, in this unit, is take what might be a degree of, say, indifference and apathy in Wright Mills's terms, and a bit of uneasiness. Okay, so we talk about disadvantage, class, gender, discrimination. That can be a bit uneasy for people who haven't had to deal with those issues before. It can cause a degree of unease and anxiety and a bit of conflict. We want to turn that into something that is positive and can be used for a sense of well-being, that actually can be a tool in your teaching. Now, I'm not going to dwell on this stuff. I just want to point out here a couple of things that are in the notes. And if I just bring over the Moodle site, you'll see down here, this week, history and philosophy, your key questions, and basically I want you to just read the first 10 to 22, page 10 to 22 of this from a project that we did a couple of years ago, and I just want you to grab this little bit of philosophy and have a bit of a think about that as well. Okay, and then we'll talk about that in our tutorials. Basically, we just use these slides as an organising principle. There are things like, there's a philosophical perspective on education here. Education is a human right, education is social justice, different perspectives of theory around idealism, pragmatism and so forth, and different philosophical orientations to schooling. I just want you to be familiar with those differences because they will lead to different outcomes in the way that you think about schooling. A bit of history, there's the ancient thinkers, going back to Plato and Aristotle, but issues like as populations grew throughout the Western world, we had the Industrial Revolution, we had reorganisation of schooling or the invention of schooling to control the masses, and essentially that model of Industrial Revolution schooling is what we still have today. The history in Australia is particularly important because our schooling here was formed on the British model, and we have that issue around the separation of church and state, the role of the federal government, things like Aboriginal students being legislatively left out of education until 1982, and things like the separation of independent and non-government schools around issues around religion. Okay, that's all important stuff for us to be aware of. And then issue of curriculum. So curriculum is a visual of knowledge. Where does it come from? Whose knowledge? Who invented it? But we'll be looking at curriculum per se in a later topic in this unit. There's one thing I want you to remember about this sort of stuff after this week's tutorials and a bit of reading. It's that school as we know it in Australia wasn't always that way. It's actually a really recent phenomenon. Secondary education in particular only started as you know it in the late 60s. Primary education only became mandatory in the late 1890s. Okay, so it's only a bit over 120 odd years ago. At the time, very few people finished primary school. At the time, in the 1960s, very few people finished high school. It's only in the last generation that the majority have even finished Year 12. And even then, it's not everyone, it's only a majority across the country. When it expanded education, it took on the characters of those that did do education in the early days, which were more the advantaged groups. So it took a curriculum and a form that was in the old grammar schools, for instance. So we've ended up with a system that we have now, which is just formed out of chance, out of the evolution of history. It hasn't been particularly designed, but it's also really new. So it doesn't mean what we do in the future has to be the same as what we do now. It's just that our organisational systems and structures and the way that we train you as teachers is based on the system as we know it. So I want you to think historically about, well, from those readings that you would do, of, well, how was school formed? And what philosophies and theories actually is it drawing on? Okay. In a later bit in the unit, we'll be doing stuff on social justice and human rights as well. So we don't need to get too bogged down with that stuff just yet. The only other thing I want to point out about history is the ACT system only came into operation in the late 1970s. Up until then, the buildings were built by the federal government and the teachers were part of New South Wales and taught the New South Wales curriculum. But the teachers here, as the ACT expanded in the 70s, didn't like the New South Wales structure of schooling, pushed against it, and eventually a new system was formed. But it was formed on the logic that was we don't want the centralised exams of New South Wales and we don't want the highly structured syllabuses of New South Wales. We want to develop our own. So they developed a school-based curriculum model that was about schools working with communities. And that was the founding principle of this jurisdiction. And that's what Hedley Bear, the initial chief executive, the centre down at Stirling there is named after, had as a vision of ACT schooling. So it actually has its own history of difference and change. How that exists today is a different question. It may not actually be meeting what he was talking about. Then a couple of things, issues that we will talk about in this unit, constantly coming up. Are we talking about education or are we talking about schooling? And are those things different? Okay. To educate might be to more than just to school. Because school has certain characteristics of maybe control and organisation. A few questions that we will get to talk about and think about in terms of the tutorials. A couple of questions that we will look at in terms of education and schooling that you will do in your tutorials. And these are just some of the philosophical ideas there that I don't need you to engage with in this point in time, but I want you to read these. They're in the readings. Come to think about them because we will be using them in our tutorials. Okay. So these slides are just here, some of the key points, and you've even got my tutorial slide there thrown in just for a bit of good measure. Okay. So let's just move to the last point. When it comes to this whole unit, when it comes to why we're looking at a bit of sociological thinking, a bit of historical thinking, it's really about, well, just because we do things now doesn't mean we have to do them this way in the future. We have to understand where they've come from and what's influenced them. Through this unit, we'll look at who the winners and losers are of the way things are now. And when it comes to your work in schools, just because that's the way the school has been doing something doesn't mean it's the way they'll do it in the future. Okay? Unless, I don't think anyone can turn around and tell me that the way we're doing things now achieves perfect results. Okay? If they can, then awesome, keep doing it. But I reckon that we can always do better and can always improve. I think that's what our purpose is. And this unit is to help you think about some of the groups and people and reasons why not everyone does as well as we might hope they would do.